we will summarize a bit of the learning, and then we will have a discussion regarding minhag and halacha, and which is very relevant for in the small communities. And what do we do? In other words, it can get very confusing, even just crossing the bridge between here and Malmö. Things that you've seen here are not the same there.
Get 5 more hours.
So we will have that discussion. Just to summarize, if anyone has any reflections on the learning before we sum it up from your own learning, either questions, and then I can repeat it out loud so that they can hear us, or the idea that what we saw in the sources is that we have very, you could say, from the sources themselves that talk about having some sort of separation between the meat and the milk. And then one saying, yeah, my father was, right, Mar Ukva, he wasn't just someone, he was the chief rabbi, right, the head of all of the galut, he also had a political position as the head of all of the galut. But he says, this is, it's obvious it was not clearly defined how much one should wait between the meat and the milk. And then we see as we progress, even the Tosfot, right, speak about something, right? It's not clear along the way when it becomes very clear that there's something called 6 hours, and we even saw that along the way as we end up between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, who is the Ashkenazi commentary on who speaks about it. So there's a lot of, so that is the direction. Did anyone you had a thought, right? Maybe you want to share and then just open up. What is the idea, first of all, or what is the difference between this little different separation and the 6 hour?
Yes, the question was about that when we eating first meat and then it staying in solar plexus for about 4 to 6 hours. So the question was that is allowed to milk and meat be mixed in the solar plexus?
So I'll just repeat so you see I have a natural microphone. So there's an idea that we saw in the different sources that some of the sources are telling us make sure the meat doesn't get stuck in, that you have to make sure there's no meat stuck in between your teeth. So we have something called a toothbrush that can solve that, right? You just rinse your mouth very well, and then you know that there's no problem. But then maybe there's another idea here that has to do with the digestive system, that has to do with waiting between meal and meal, having to do with how long does it actually take to digest. So that's maybe an idea of why we have these two opinions. Is it in the mouth or in the digestive system?
Digestive system, because after we get acid in the solar plexus, so the meat be departed in another shape. But up to 4 to 6 hours, it can still be in the solar plexus.
And if
Did anybody have a different idea of why to wait between the hours? We heard the digestive reason. Is there any other reason? You thought about it? Everything is relevant, so there's no right and wrong. Speculation.
Yeah, to wait until the next meal.
Because of digestive reasons, or you thought about a different reason?
No, just like if you have a separation between the meals, that this is if you have a pastrama for breakfast, for instance, and then you wait for the next meal. But it still has like a distance between hours. It depends because some people wait 5 hours and some get hungry after 2 hours. But at least wait until the next meal and don't have a dessert right after. That is halavi.
Okay, Daniel, you wanted to comment? Thank you.
Yeah, to be practical, and also if you have a table and you have milk and meat. So if you have to wait hours, you will not have meat from the center.
So it's more technical to make sure that you don't end up mixing by mistake. For example, we walked into the kitchen this morning and there was a plate of pastrama that was left there yesterday. and all of this cheese all around. So just to give an example, just to mention what you're saying, that we have a clear, that we don't end up mixing the meat and the milk. Any other? Yes,
It was one thing that one person
just talk
discussed.
aloud, you're next to the
Yeah.
computer.
Okay, so it was one thing that one of the people talked about was that one of the people, I can't refer better, that if there's meat in the teeth, then we call it meat, so therefore it is meat. But if you've eaten it, I wouldn't, if it's gone into your digestive system, I don't know the word for it, but I wouldn't call it meat anymore. It's not like you can throw it up and repurpose it. It's like it's something else now.
So once that you're saying that the separation has to do with the process of eating itself.
Yeah.
And once we finished eating, we shouldn't care so much whether.
Yeah, because then it's not meat anymore. It's a different substance. I don't know what to name it, but I wouldn't be able to repurpose it. It's not like I can throw it up and use it for lunch.
Okay.
Like it's
Yeah.
As long as you're not a cow.
yeah. I try not to.
Thing that is not permitted is to eat. So as long as it's in your teeth and you swallow it with milk, then you have eaten meat and milk together. If it's mixed in the stomach, you haven't eaten it. Well, eating happens here, not down there. Like those little example.
Yeah.
So maybe that's basically the question. What is separation, right? One says separation is not about eating, it's about having it in the same table. Others will say having it in the same meal. Others will say having it in the same teeth. And others will say having it in the same digestive system. And we heard all of these opinions, all of them could be understood from the text, and all of them get to a different conclusion depending on the question, what is mixing here? The Torah is mixing. What does that mean?
If I want to add one other explanation is that not about the teeth, taste between the teeth, but the taste in the mouth. And that's one of the reasons why people wait after stinky cheese 6 hours, because it has the strong taste as meat. And if you go according to that, then it's the taste in the mouth, and then it's not enough to clean the teeth, because the taste is there more normally for meat.
Following up on the Shmuel Shul from last week, it's obvious, I think, to all of the sources that we've seen, that we don't take the issue of the kid, right, of the goat in that sense, right? That none of the halachic sources are saying, well, we have to be careful because we're going to end up eating a kid in its mother's milk. Rather, there's a definite understanding that meat and milk themselves should not be mixed for whatever reason. So I think that comes. Shmuel,
Yes, that's the one of the first basic ideas here is that when the Torah says "Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo," you will not cook a kid in its mother's milk. It's maybe perhaps an expression, perhaps an example, but it's not really what the text of the Torah is talking about. The Torah is talking about something more essential, cooking an animal, like a sheep or a cow in milk. That's the main prohibition. Discussed that certain like birds were actually an added gezerah to protect this, and added the law that the Chachamim made to protect us from this main averah. Main prohibition here is the possibility you might cook meat and milk together. Because we've gone quite far from that, gone to the world of eating together, and then actually eating not even together, but eating at different times. It might still be linked if you need to wait a certain amount of time. But I think in all these things, we often feel like, well, the rabbis are very strict, and like, why have they made so many laws that are going so far from the actual text? But I think there's a lot of knowledge about people's habits, people's way of life that the Chachamim took into account. And there was definitely a feeling that if you just keep it to the minimum, like the Torah says, just don't cook some cow with milk, some steak with milk. Don't have a cheeseburger. So many other things will come, and eventually that line will not be so clear. And Chachamim created a system where meat and milk don't mix at all. So the idea of having a cheeseburger would not come into your mind anymore. It's completely outside of your world because you're worrying about things such as, well, how long do I have to wait? I have to have had a normal burger before I can have cheese. So you see this in the laws of Kashrut, you see this very much also in the laws of Shabbat, which many of you have learned over the winter. That the Chachamim were always looking at what were the issues that people were dealing with, what were common mistakes that people made, and how could they correct these mistakes. So it was a very wise, it's a very like well thought of system that we're actually seeing in the Halakha.
It's interesting when I think in terms of this separation, because we already started asking questions last week, or I brought up some issues because we're entering a different world now, in which you have vegan cheese, and you have soon you're going to have lab meat, which is parve, right? So in that, what? Probably parve, according to some opinions. So just to think of the technology and also what that creates, the challenges of in terms of understanding, a deeper understanding. But going back to this, let's just sum up the opinions or the process that we saw, and then we can go into, unless of Joav, if you wanted to comment on.
No, continue. I'll comment later. Don't worry.
Okay. So just the process itself that we saw in the sources, that it also, we could connect it to, just before we go through that, we could also, there's obviously cultural differences of how one looks at meat and one looks at cheese. We have this, for example, in the upcoming Chag of Shavuot, in which there's a special, it's a special Chag specifically for eating cheese. But you'll see suddenly halachic opinions that say, wait, but it's not going to be considered a meal if we don't have meat. Right? It's not a real meal. We saw that on Shabbat, that it's important to have wine and bread. But for some, if you don't have meat, it's not considered a meal. Ask Al Jair, and they'll tell you if you do have meat, it's not considered a meal. Right? So, in other words, there's a big cultural difference. But for some, I think in Scandinavia, cheese is essential. It's a big part of what you're doing. So that will serve what for many was meat. And then maybe there's a difference also, because if cheese is a side thing or it's a main dish, that could also make a difference in how we approach how much we have to eat. For just eating a side dish, then it's not a big thing. Maybe if it's ice cream after a meal, would we see that as different than having a cheese meal, right? A real cheese meal after? And also just that one more thing, cheese today is not real cheese. Cheese today it's just many times watery product that is made out of a product which is made out of milk. It doesn't go through the same process that cheese is, the proper cheese go through, in which you're talking about weeks or months of development. So that when we talk about cheese also in those times, right? Cheese, for example, that it's so problematic because it's made within, right, with the enzymes of the animal. So that's a different process today than the fast food process of cheese, which takes just a few minutes to create. So that's just some notes on that. But what we saw is through just going through the sources themselves, which is similar to the process of halakha that we saw on Shabbat. That you start out with a discussion or even a story in the Talmud, and it's not even right. That story itself is not a directive. Well, my dad used to do this. Great, my grandma did this. Right? You don't think of it in the same sense, but when the head of all of the diaspora Jews says, this is what happened, it's a bit more than a story, is the point. But then going through the period of the Tosfot, when we see the first discussions, it's still we don't have we still don't have a clear distinction. There's also a source that we didn't bring from Rashi. Right, we're talking about the beginning of Ashkenazi Jewry, which is why these sources are important, because you see that there's a big difference between Ashkenaz and Sfarad in this. But within those sources, all the way down to we're talking about the 10th, 11th, and 13th century. We also had a source where you see that there's still not a clear distinction of 6 hours. Then we're down to when we come to Maimonides, right? I'm just going through the centuries with you. We come to Maimonides, suddenly it's very clear cut, right? 6 hours. And wait, where did that come from? 1 second, just give us some space here in this, right? We didn't see that before. Suddenly it's very strict, 6 hours. But then you see that the Shulchan Aruch follows that. But then the Ramah, what is he bringing in? The whole book of the Ramah, which we've seen many times in the Shurim, what is he trying to say? Yes, that may be the case, that's what is written. However, what am I following even more than what is written? The Minhag, right? I'm following, what do I see is followed in all of the Ashkenazi communities? Because his comment is basically saying, no, people are not following 6 hours. So, sorry?
Not following an hour.
They're not following, right?
Not following 6 hours.
Not following 6 hours, right? We have the comment there that he said you can follow, right? He's reminding you that back at the source, we're talking about 1 hour, which turned into 6 hours. And then he says, but 1 hour is okay, but you should follow 6 hours, right?
He didn't say 1 hour, say nothing in the start. So he comes with the nothing and the 6. And he says the normal is 1. 1 doesn't have any source.
The one, okay.
Doesn't have any source.
The one that he brings there is
The Minhag is without any source. That's just what people do. Never mind.
so go ahead, explain.
It's just the way he says it. He comes with all the opinions. So he says, okay, you say 6, but there are people who say, what is that?
Go ahead.
So he begins saying, no, why 6 shouldn't wait. Then after that, he doesn't follow his own opinion, saying you don't wait, you just like say bracha and you clean. But then he says, but the normal thing is the minhag is 1 hour. And then he explains that 1 hour is not from after you say the bracha, but after you eat the meat. But you have to remember that it's not enough to wait an hour if you haven't said the bracha, haven't finished the meal. So that's what.
And you shouldn't be saying the bracha.
And in the end, he says, but some people say that it's important to follow 6. So it says a lot about nothing or the minhag 1, and then he says, but it's actually good to keep 6. So how do we say? If you read Ramah, you can do what you want because he gives you all the answers.
So just to, if we're following that mindset of the Ramah, what is he basically saying? I think it's very relevant for us. Okay, someone that's grown up in a community and you've learned, okay, well, we keep 6 hours, right? Let's say someone is in a community in which it's very clear that they have old minhagim in Poland, for example, right? So they're following, they have 6 hours, okay? Then suddenly you end up here on Shabbat and you see the rabbi after, if you noticed, after 1 hour.
Here doesn't eat meat.
Okay, that's true. But you follow the rabbi and you see the rabbi, let's say, eat meat, and then an hour later you see him sitting and eating cheese. So that is the minhag here. So this is very relevant because many people might come and say they have it wrong in Copenhagen. We know, we looked it up, we learned the halakha. The halakha, even the Ramah who says an hour says, well, you should actually do 6. So how do you end up? And then just to add to the confusion, let's add a few more minhagim. There's some who keep 5 hours. We saw that mentioned once, a 5 hour. And then there's something which is not mentioned, which is might even be a printer's error, which is 3 hours. But you have customs of strong Orthodox communities today. The people say, my grandfather kept 3 hours. I'm going to keep 3 hours. Okay. Now, just to make it a bit, to take that as well, what do you do when you have to have a kosher system, such as a community? If you have a school, if you have a kindergarten, right, full school on. If you have, what do you do in the army? right? When you have everyone coming there together in the Israeli army, keeping kosher, what are you telling the kitchens? Can you serve after 3, after 5? Do you have to wait for 6? That's very difficult. People coming in and out all of the time. Are you gonna have a clear cut after until everyone? When is the end of the meal? When are you starting? This becomes when we come mixed communities in many senses, it becomes confusing. And what do I follow? And what is the right thing to follow? And then the question could be someone who either grew up non-religious or is in a process of conversion. What should they take upon themselves? Right? What is the right thing? Well, if you're reading in the Shulchan Aruch 6 hours, so is that the best thing to do? Or if your community is following 1 hour, then that is good as well. So I thought it's all of this, right? Just posing this question, it's complicated itself. But the fact that we do represent different communities, even here in different minhagim, I think it's an important opportunity. One last thing I'm going to add before I let you have comment on all of this. You can start and prepare yourself. What happens when within our own cities, we might even have more than one minhag. You have a community, and then you might have another shul, right, in the same community. Is there something called minhag makom? Is there something called what is the minhag of a place? Does a community set that? If someone else sets up a different community, for example, is that suddenly change and allow someone to choose between the two? I'm just adding that to all of this. So Joav, good luck.
The example that we study is a very good example because it's, as we saw in the last source, it's not a main halacha question. The halacha question is cooking meat and milk together, eating what is cooked together, eating what is mixed together that is not allowed by the rabbis. And now we go another step that is from the Talmud seems as if there is no problem. It came later that waiting between it's so in one hand, it's something that if we go to when we ask a question about cooking on Shabbat, that's like an important question because if we cook on Shabbat, we break the rule from the Torah about the Shabbat. It's a real serious thing. Here we say it's the end of something. It's not really something that has sources in Halakha, it's sources in Minhag. In the second hand, when you experience of keeping mitzvot and keeping kosher, one of the parts in kosher that is most felt is this waiting, because you always counting, when did I eat, when can I eat again? I remember in my military service in Israel, I had someone together with me that wasn't religious at all. He didn't keep Shabbat, he didn't pray, he was like really secular. But waiting between meat and milk, that was very important for him. And he waited 3 hours. And I was religious and I waited 1 hour. And he didn't understand, how can you be religious and wait 1 hour? It doesn't work. Because it's so, and you could explain, yes, but you have to understand and take the sources and explain. But in the experience of keeping kosher, this is something that is very, has become something that people feel and follow and are waiting, especially in the way we, maybe in old days, didn't use so much milk, but just drinking the coffee. And so many people I know that don't eat meat because then they have to wait 6 hours for the coffee and that's too much. And it's something that is very common and you feel it. And Baruch Hashem also, people are very loyal to this minhag, very loyal to this minhag. And because of that, it's very little important in one hand, and in the second hand, very much important. When that is said, we mentioned Shulchan Aruch and Rema, and I could give a little historical background for that, because I think it's important to understand the importance of minhagim and how halacha has developed. Shulchan Aruch was written by Rabbi Yosef Karo. He wrote the Bet Yosef. He lived in Tzfat. He was, I think, second generations for family who fled from Spain in the exile from Spain, expulsion from Spain, and then were in Greece and came to Tzfat. And he wrote one thing. He wrote a book that is incredible, the Bet Yosef. It's a book that it's an encyclopedia about everything that was written before him in a very clear way, and that someone could sit in all days and write and gather so much in one book is incredible. And then in the end, there is another book that is bottom line, helping people to know, okay, what do I do? Okay, I could read a lot, but what do I do? Shulchan Aruch is only the bottom line. We saw Shulchan Aruch was like that, and Ramah was much bigger. It's well, only the bottom line. But Shulchan Aruch was not the first rabbi who wrote a halacha book. We have many halacha books. We read from Rambam, from Maimonides, but we have many halacha books, and also Shulchan Aruch is based on halacha book of the two. So we also looked on. So it's we have lots of halacha books. So why did Shulchan Aruch become so central? And one of the reasons, of course, is it's based on the Bet Yosef and gives a real a good overview of all the rabbis before him, all the from the Torah through the Talmud and through the rabbis in a good way, and also that there is a system there of how to decide what halacha is. But the historical is what happened with Spain, actually. The historical reason is that it was a time where communities were confused of what they should do, because after the Jews were sent out of Spain, all the communities where these Jews came were a mixture of Jews from different minhagim. So, because it also in Spain, we had one minhag in one city and another minhag in another city. And now these two Jews come from there, and they meet a third Jew that lived from before in Greece or in Israel or in Egypt or where they went. And now we have three minhagim in the same community, and Jews
they would even marry.
Or married in the same family, and Jews are good in discussing. And then came this book of Shulchan Aruch in the right time to give guidance. And that's one of the reasons why Sephardic Jews, the Jews are those who came from Spain and mixed in Northern Africa and other Sephardic communities in the Middle East and Southeastern Europe. These communities follow until the day of today Shulchan Aruch, because the communities accepted Shulchan Aruch as the guidance. And then at the same time we had Ramah that we read, and he lived in Europe. In some Jews from Spain came also to the communities of Europe, of East Europe, but they were few. There were few. There were some Sephardic communities in Eastern Europe also, but mainly it was Ashkenazi Jews who had their communities and continued their minhag. And because of that, he says what he said always. He quotes, "Yes, Shulchan Aruch says this, but in our communities it's normal to do so and so." Or there are communities who do so and so to protect, in the one hand, to accept the Shulchan Aruch as, and because of that, we have Shulchan Aruch and Ramah together that included almost all the Jewish people, because everyone could find their answers in the same book, because it came together. But in the second hand, what Ramah does is protecting the minhag that was in the community, saying it's important to follow the minhag in your community, that communities that are mixed could continue their tradition that they had from before. And that's what's happening in our situation. There is a halacha discussion about should we wait or should we not wait. Shulchan Aruch says we should wait. And then waiting, Shulchan Aruch says, according to Maimonides and others, Rosh, of course, it's 6 hours, or as 6 hours, as someone said, or 5 or 6 hours, but let's call it 6 hours. And then there was the other opinion saying you shouldn't wait. But Ramah, in addition to saying the halacha, as we say, but the minhag here, the minhag is one hour, because that's what people do. And minhagim are important to follow, but just to make it harder and more complicated, the Jews in the area where Ramah lived, maybe when he lived for 500 years ago, he witnesses that the minhag was 1 hour, but 200 years later, the minhag there was 6 hours. Also according to his own words. saying, yes, I mean, but it's good, it's good to go over to 6.
Because of his words.
Maybe because of his words. And by that, we have Minhagim we protect them, but they're also changing in the end.
Good. No, go ahead. No, good. Okay. One thing which is, I think, important, I'm sure, one thing that is very important for our understanding here is that it's very clear that there's no opinions that tell you that the 6 hours is deoraita. Because then we would say, okay, well, if you know that even according to some opinions that we should be doing, then we would have less flexibility for the minhag. But everyone knows the sources that you all saw today. And then you know that there's a minhag, and then you have a question of how important it is to follow the minhag, which is more strict, which is the 6 hours, right? To remember that that is the starting point is very crucial. Because if it was not the case, even when Maimonides says 6, we know, now you know as well after this morning, okay, well, this is the process and this is how we ended up with 6, and that's a good thing to do. But we leave it at that, and then we say, well, there are others who didn't develop that understanding like Maimonides, and they have their own minhagim. But that basis of understanding of the sources itself is crucial to understand how much flexibility we have. And you saw that within the Ramah. It says 1 hour, he says 6, but then maybe 1, and then it's good to do 6. So you see that back and forth between, as Joav is saying, what he's experiencing in his community to what he knows from the Shulchan Aruch, from Maimonides, and trying to bridge there, but also not pointing and saying what you're doing is wrong. That's very important. He's not pointing and saying this is what is wrong. And I think just a comment, there's a big difference between like when you have the Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam, so that they set up a very strong community with all of their minhagim, with their own shul, which you can visit today, a beautiful shul. If you're in Amsterdam, I really suggest I think it's beautiful to see. But that is very isolated. They're taking and transporting themselves from there to there. And according to halacha, if you're doing so and you have your own minhagim, you can continue doing your own minhagim. But if a person is a private person who's traveling to another community, he should take on himself the minhagim of that community. There's a difference between if I do it as a community or a sub-community to if I do it privately, because it's almost also not derech eretz, not menschlichkeit, to come and say, I know it's right, what I'm doing is right, I'm going to do it differently than you because this is what we did. So just adding a bit to
if you already mentioned it, the Portuguese community in Holland and northern Germany was it's a unique story about minhagim because they were converted to Christianity 150 years.
Yeah.
So they came when they were allowed to show the Judaism again in Holland. They came to Ashkenazi area, and they didn't know what their minhagim were because they weren't allowed to keep them, but they remembered that they were Jewish. So the Ashkenazi rabbis teach them back how to be Jewish, but teach them the Sephardic tradition. So they went to Ashkenazi area and learned from the Ashkenazi rabbis how to be Sephardic Jews. And a very, very special story.
Yeah, I want to say we're talking about minhagim, a question that often arises, like I already touched upon it, like perhaps when Jews did not grow up with a lot of traditional observance, or people who are not Jewish who want to convert, is the question what minhag to follow, and maybe maybe one step backward, why do you need a minhag? Yeah, people are sometimes ask me like, I'm doing is right. Somebody came to me recently. A person who's a Ger Tzedek, very, very special person, converted completely in a very, very serious way, keeps the Torah, the Halacha very strongly. And he asked me, like, Kitniyot, from everything that he's seen in Halacha, Kitniyot does not have a lot of basis. That's a subject we can discuss another time, or Pesach. But most of you probably know Ashkenazim have very special customs of not eating certain vegetables, certain types of vegetables and their legumes on Pesach, even though they're completely kasher at Pesach, but custom not to eat them. Also, some Sephardic communities won't eat salmon. And he said, look, he didn't have this from his family. Their parents were Jewish. And in the Torah, in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, there's nothing about it. So he likes to usually keep Ashkenazi customs. He prays some Ashkenazi Siddur and he does everything. But like, why shouldn't he eat kidneyot? There's no basis for it. So why not just eat them? That's a hard question. I think it's very important for every Jew to be part of something, be part of a community, to be part of a custom, to be part. Yeah. Sometimes you might want to choose, you're not sure yet where to go. In a way, here it's simpler in Scandinavia because we don't have so many options, but you have your one community and you try to follow what's accepted there. But even here, often a lot of people have come from different places and do things a bit differently. I think it's very important for everybody to be part of something, to feel there is a custom, there is something I'm connecting to. Because I think it's very hard to hold on, even if you have a very strong understanding of the Torah or a very strong spiritual feeling about the Torah. But if you don't feel like you're part of a community and you've got some customs, then it's going to be very hard to, first of all, pass that on to your children and be the next generation. But also it's going to be very hard to hold on to it yourself. Very often, like I feel like, you have a difficult situation. What keeps you going? It's that this is the minhag. This is something my father did, my grandfather did. This is something important. Sometimes even there's like an interest there. Some of you may know. My own father is French. He comes originally his family came from North Africa. So sometimes you want like research. I find a book that talks about what was done in Morocco and Algeria. Very interesting. What was the custom? Perhaps my grandfather also did. Because these things, they make you connected. These things, they make you feel like there's something. And I pass it on to my children. I'm not just saying, I feel good about it, and this is the way, and this is God's way. But I'm saying, like, don't turn your back on it. This is something real that's been going on for generations. So I think it's something to keep in mind that minhagim might seem strange for somebody who's starting and who's just opening the book and doesn't see basis for them. But very often, these are the things that keep the Jews connected, exactly as in Joav's story about the soldier. The one thing he held on to was this waiting for 3 hours.
Maybe fill us in a bit about your community and where the minhagim come from. It's fascinating. We have that opportunity.
Right. So
in Helsinki, where does it start? And from the minhagim that maybe were there to today.
Right. Yeah. So in Helsinki, of course, the founders of the community were from Eastern Europe, Ashkenazim, but not from any specific place in Ashkenaz, because in Eastern Europe, a big part from Poland, all the way to Lithuania, and a lot of areas were conquered by the Russians in the early 19th century, together with Finland. And the Tsar started taking young Jewish boys into the Russian army. And then at the end of 20 years of service, they're allowed to settle down where their base was. And some of them settled down in Finland. And that's how the community started. They brought the rabbis there from the stronger communities in Eastern Europe. And so from the beginning, it was first of all a mixture of different customs within the Eastern Europe. There was also a lot of people who were not knowledgeable. They had been taken as children into the army. So they didn't necessarily have a clear custom of what was actually done at home. They remember probably certain things, but not so much if you're taken as a child. And some other built a community based on this, with probably a lot of it was taught by their rabbi. Whatever he taught them, that's what they kept doing. And with time, things have changed as well. Like there's been big movements of Aliyah out of Finland to Israel. There's also been people from other places who have moved there. Even just yesterday, we had a very interesting situation where we have two people saying Kaddish. And one of them is a Finnish Jew who's been many generations in Finland. And, his ancestors came 5 from great-great-great-grandfather. And there was a Jew who's very active in the community's everyday life. But he's moved there himself. He's lived in Israel, and his parents are originally from Syria. And they're both saying Kaddish. So one was saying the Sephardic way, one was saying the Ashkenazi way. And suddenly I see one man, he stopped saying Kaddish. What's going on? Like, why are you stopping? I thought you were in mourning with your he was saying Kaddish for your mother. So I can't keep up with him because he's too fast. So I went to him, to this other man. I said, "Can you go a bit slower?" So I said to him, "No, but he had some funny words. It disturbs me. I can't go any slower." So I think here we have a very good example of what can happen in a community. Now, if you look
A
at
good example of a rabbi leading in Kaddish.
that's why in Copenhagen, the rabbi is Kaddish cloud. Everyone has to follow his Kaddish. So
Excuse me, I'm not sure I could follow the express lane.
no, Kaddish and Shabbat is slow. So this is one lazy. So as the rabbi was saying, that technically, if you come from another race, you should say the Kaddish the way it's said in that place because you're not enjoying that. At the same time, person has lost his mother. He's attached to this custom. You don't want to be the person telling him what to do. So it's a very tricky thing. It's one of
What you were speaking about is actually Minhag two parts. One, I mean, both have connections.
Yeah.
One, you say, I do what my grandfather did, my great and I connect myself to the tradition I have got. And the second one is I connect to the place. Minhag originally was the Minhag Makom, the Minhag of the place. So when you move from one community with a strong Minhag to another community, you adapt the Minhag of the new community because you have to behave as them. But as we told before, and especially also in our times, all our communities, also here, are a mixture of minhagim. People come from different places, and here we have a mixture of a minhag that is minhag of the place, and the minhag of the person. And it's unclear. In all days, the minhag of the place is the one that you about the place. But our generation looks at it in a different way, and you can't anymore. Some places you can have, actually here in Copenhagen, there is a very strong minhag here, so it's nice to follow that. But most places, especially in Israel, in the States, when you have Jews from different places because they gather there newly, and as happened in so our community in Oslo and Helsinki are a mixture of Jews from different places. And I think it's nice, but maybe the step ahead is that sometimes when we read these sources, we think that if the rabbis, here we have a panel of rabbis, they sit and discuss and they give advice and that's happening. Actually, what is deciding in the end, the minhag, also halakha in English, but especially the minhag, is what people do. What people do in the end, of course, the sources, the traditions, the teaching that normally the rabbis lead is important. So Rema says, as you said, 1 hour is a tradition, but he also said maybe it's good to keep 6, and then he changed the minhag, maybe is him, or it was changed. So the question if Rema is 1 or 6, it doesn't say this is correct and this is wrong. In the end, people follow something, and what people follow is the minhag. So minhag is not a question of the rabbis. Minhag is a question of what people together do.
I think it follows very much.
although you have to do what we say, of course.
It follows very much the story we saw on Shabbat. That if Rav Joav was to stand here and say, this is what you should do, and I will prove it by this ceiling falling down on your head right now, right? Then at the end of the day, Hashem gave us the power to bring the Torah down to this earth. That's what we learned on Shabbat very strongly. And therefore the minhag is a reflection of where Am Yisrael is. It's a reflection of where the people are. How you're living Torah and mitzvot creates, I would say even spiritually, creates a place in which that is creating the divine presence of Hashem in this world. So it could be, for me at least, it's very relatable to that. Yes.
I would like to go a little, take what you said just now. One of the experiences a religious person has in Israel is that a non-religious person will come up to you and says, where does it say in the Torah that you can't pick something on Shabbat? Or where does it say in the Torah that you can, like in Israel, it's a very known thing that like the Torah is the source of authority, and the rabbis are sort of playing playing along, making it harder and harder and harder. And it's hard for a religious Jew to try and explain, yeah, it doesn't say it in the Torah, but when you go on to the Shulchan Aruch, it says that. And it doesn't say it in the Shulchan Aruch, but when you go on to the Minhag, then it says that. And then you sometimes will get a rolling of the eyes saying, okay, you're really crazy. And what I want to say by this is that picking up on this thing, to me, it's always very important to understand these roots. Like Shmuel described, it looks so disattached in a way, this idea of kitniot from the general rules of Pesach. But then when you know that there is a reason that kitniot came in, and this reason has, I would say it in a very maybe spiritual way. I don't know if all of rabbis will agree with this way of putting it, but the fact that it came into the discussion and took such a strong part in the discussion, I believe is the will of God. It's something that, like many things in history, things happen without us understanding exactly or knowing in advance that this will go this way. And when we're talking about a minhag, there's a sentence that is in the Talmud, Minhag Yisrael Torah. The minhag of Israel is Torah. And sometimes it is described as even more important than the Torah. And it's a good question to what is my minhag, what is the minhag of Makom. I can tell you that in my experience, which I'm now ruining all the structure that you gave, I grew up in a certain minhag of my parents and where I grew up. And then I became older and I was exposed to the world of Hasidic Jewry. And I changed a lot of minhagim. I don't do as my parents did, and I don't do as my community did. I did the way that Hasidim do. And there are very, very different things that I do as a Hasid that my father doesn't do. And it was a very big struggle for me to realize, is this something that I'm willing to pick on? It's a big chutzpah. And I talked about it with my father, but it was a way of connecting to Hasidism. And maybe you can connect to it, people who are going through conversion or through accepting Jewish tradition upon you, this moment that you say, yeah, I believe in it so much that I'm willing to break away from my parents. I'm willing to break away from what my parents would consider to be right. And I'm bringing this up because in a one way, it breaks all what we've talked about, what is a minhag, and to follow the minhag makom and the minhag of the parents. But on the other hand, I'm trying to underline what is a minhag in the sense that it's not precisely what is written in the Torah. It's not precisely what is written in the halakha and the Shulchan Aruch, but sometimes it gives you this kind of identity that nothing else will give you. And so when you're asking what is my minhag, and you're following a certain minhag, it could be the minhag of your place, it could be the minhag of your parents, it could be a different minhag. You shouldn't switch minhagim. You shouldn't do what you prefer. But you should realize that this part of Judaism that seems maybe as distant as possible from the Torah, maybe will give you the biggest feeling of identity that you can ever have.
I had to the question I had the same
Speak loud so that
I had the same journey in a way. I came very close to a Hasidic I can't say a court, but a group in Beit Israel that and started to change a few traditions and things that I did, and it was an amazing relief for me when I went back to the family traditions when I stopped seeking and went back home to find it. So I felt like I heard your story and I remember how it was. I tried to find it elsewhere, and I felt very much connected and such. And then at some point, I felt it wasn't my truth. So and you mentioned the kitniot. I remember that there was a couple in this community that she converted, and he was a Jewish Natan. And at some point, they felt they asked me many halachic questions. But at some point, I could see that they avoid asking questions because they found out that almost every time they call me about something, I allow it. Like whatever they need, and they felt like I'm too lenient, they're allowing too many things, and they feel like I always say it's allowed. And though usually I say that there are reasoning in that, but you can allow it. That's why I usually don't. I don't like to say this is what you're supposed to do. I say you can do that. You can also do this, and like you can have this variety of options. But then suddenly they found me back when he came from a Spartan background, and they ate kitniot, and I said, no, you're not allowed to. And we're like, what? He said, the rabbi came and told us we're not allowed to do something, and they felt like they needed it. Like they needed me to at some point say a line, and I said the line exactly on the place of Minhag, of the Minhag HaCohen. I said there's a value, especially in Denmark, especially there's so few countries in the world. I don't know if you said before, there's so few countries in the world where you still have Minhag HaCohen, because all the Jews became immigrants. All the Jewish centers in the world are of immigrants. So in England, you have Minhag HaCohen, maybe at some communities. In Denmark, you have Minhag HaCohen. But whoever didn't disappear with immigration, Hitler ruined the last part of it. So there are very few places in Switzerland here.
Italy.
It's not a few places, but it's almost. Yeah. So you have, and I said, this was meant so much in the past. You can see how much it filled in that. So when you fit, then you have to. And if you come here, you're not allowed to keep it. Like different, like in the places that you can keep it, we have to do it like from this perspective, because if we want to do it, but that's also regarding the 1 hour. So here in Denmark, 1 hour.
So,
Oh, I actually didn't have a question. So how does every community have written set of local customs? Because like when it comes to the Shulchan Aruch, there is like only one way how to do things. Like that's the manual. Then the Rama says is becoming more benevolent in things like adding the Ashkenazi point of views. Like you can do this, you can do that, depending on something else. And then you come to the community. So how do I know, coming as a newcomer, that the break between milk and cheese in Denmark is 1 hour, coming to Helsinki it's 6 hours? Is like, do I have to like call the rabbi or like go for a consultation where like I have list of questions to get all the answers, but obviously there is probably going to be something I forget. So is there like a written set of the local minhag which people could have a look at?
I would answer you just to say the opposite of my brother. About the importance of Minhag HaCohen. But I want to say, let's look at our own community.
you're so diplomatic. I agree, but yeah.
In Scandinavia, when you begin saying a good thing, you know that the bad is coming. If you say a bad thing, you know the good is coming. So, so if we look in our communities, being honest, it's hard to say that we have a very strong minhag because most of our members do not follow the minhag. Most, and it's some of you are even in a conversion process, and it's very hard to go into a community where the gate into the community is more strict than the norm between most of the members, and it's a problematic thing. because in old days, the minhag was all over. You went into a community and behaved as everyone else. It wasn't written, it was just over there. Like you look what they do, and you do the same. So that's why it wasn't written, it was just doing. And now we have to go back to our sources to find they did like this, and yeah, we still have 20, 30, 40, maybe more families who do that. And I agree, keep the minhag hamakom, but we don't have it in that way. And that explains what we have now. So we have the minhag hamakom, but we also have to connect, and that is a place where some connect more to one direction or go more to the direction of their ancestors, or but trying not to do a mixture of a little there, a little that, a little that, a little of that, because then it sometimes becomes a salad that is not a good salad. But the answer is you have to ask, you have to know. But in old days it was very easy to know, and the minhag could be different 200 years before. Now we will go 200 years back and see what did they do here. That is our minhag here now. But if there were a full community that kept the minhagim in 200 years, these minhagim will have been the same with some changes, because things change, and that we don't have.
Rambam said that you have to keep the minhag unless this minhag is an obstacle to something in the community and such. I would say many times that in our community, there are some of the traditions, some of the melodies, for example, I mentioned yesterday, some of the melodies are terrible. If it ruined our prayer experience, so it had a downside. If there's no downside, if we go from this side or that side, then it's fine. But also there, we have people in this community, very few, who know the tradition, right? As it's like one or two families. But then they can, if they start shouting on the person who does something wrong in the prayer.
That's Kaddish. That's Kaddish.
If they start shouting on someone who does something wrong, going up from the wrong direction to the Torah, you're mad. This would be like or singing the wrong melody. There was once a Chazan sang the Birkat Kohanim for Pesach in Sukkot. It was if they start shouting, that that's an obstacle, because you have other important values there. So there's an importance of minhag when it's something that binds us together. Just like you said, if the minhag is a tool to be part of who we are as a group, then it's a very good. But if it becomes something that splits a community, those who insist on having minhag, and that's why you can't change anything in the synagogue. And those who wants to make changes to make it relevant, but then they go in a conflict, neither are in the right place. It's something that has to be in a process that should sometimes create a custom. Hopefully you will be part of creating this custom, and we will have much more people who will observe and keep the rule, that it will be obvious for the next generation what is the custom, because anyone she will ask in the synagogue will give her the answer. Then it's a custom.
But that's not a reality, unfortunately.
So let's create that reality. That's our goal.
That's how I think there is just reflecting, and I think from the perspective also from hearing many people in the Beit Din, I think there's a lot of phobia, saying, did I do this wrong? Am I afraid, right? Did I do this wrong? Am I doing this right? Maybe I'm doing it wrong out of the best intention. And in that sense, knowing that there's different minhagim, and that if you saw something, it doesn't mean you were doing it wrong the whole time. It means there was a minhag. In many cases, there was just a minhag, and you can clarify that with your rabbi, I think. But I'd like to strengthen what we're hearing here, that one of the women once said in the Beit Din, it's been so confusing for me, I want it to be confusing less for my kids. And in that sense, I think that having, taking like this Beit Midrash as it is, and learning seriously and building up a very strong backbone of who you are, and having the Torah and having an understanding of halakha will give that for your own families, Bezrat Hashem, that it be less confusing. This is how we do it. And that you know that it's okay, because there's there are different ways. within, as you've seen over this Shabbat and this Sunday. So that hopefully is a relief and a support for you than anything else, but also to your question, yes, you have a rabbi, so you can make a list and sit down and get that and go through it. And if he's not decisive enough, then go to another one. Yeah, just
I heard it need to call Jair because he only can answer.
yeah.
Don't need to listen to whatever you have, just write.
Yeah,
for
yeah.
the one question.
Receiving tens of.
Yeah.
messages from-
I'll be very happy.
Okay, so we have that, and that is recorded right now. Yes. But
Please. All the Jews in the community, they don't ask questions because they don't keep halakha. So I get some questions.
You don't wanna be a burden. You're like, he has like 3 kids. You're always running around, you never stand still. You're like, it's 9 o'clock. Do I really want to ask him this question? I think
Ask those here that ask me questions.
I never seen anybody answering questions so quickly.
No, quickly, I'm not sure. That was lucky.
It doesn't always happen while you are at.
If you send that
Right.
WhatsApp, don't send me
That's
emails. Don't send me emails.
even though the
WhatsApp.
even though we have a few comments here, I'd like to take, but I also, one thing that we mentioned, that you be a support group for one another. And now we have this WhatsApp group that was created over this Shabbat. And anyone who's on a line who would like to join, it doesn't mean you had to come to be a part of this group. So I think it's a good way. Emails are more difficult for some, but just to say, hey guys, an open question. Or support, like we mentioned before, but just to open up a question, and then if we have time, we can also intervene. Or if there's an open question, maybe that's also.
If you have a halachic question, then maybe some others have. So if you ask the halachic question instead of to me, you put it on the group, then one of us answering. Don't spam it, okay? So you can we can put questions. Don't spam it with other links to whatever, like inspiration and setting up. I'd like ask a question, and then we can give an answer.
Okay, we had a few. Just speak loudly, so we can hear you.
Minhag HaMakom, the local custom. What is the time frame to a new local custom to be made as a custom, as a local custom? How many years, how many generations that people will follow this thing, so that we can say, okay, this is Minhag HaMakom.
So there is the discussion in the Mishnah Berurah that we saw on Shabbat. There's also another more lengthy book called Biur Halacha, and which he discusses what is a kihila. In other words, what is even considered a community, and within that, what happens if you have 2 communities? You're doing 2 separate things. I know that in Malmö there's constant questions on Facebook because you have Shabbat time at this time in the community, and then you have others who are following the internet or other times, or Chabad might have other times as well. So what is considered? And if you have the basic, what it says, if you have the backbone of a community, you have a Bet Knesset, you have a mikveh, you have everything that is necessary in a functioning community, that is the word, a functioning community, then that is considered a minhag. That is what you should follow, and it's actually not allowed to violate that and create something different. So yes, you might have cases, someone follows their own Sfaradi, Kitniot, etc. But in general, to come out with a statement and say, we have a different minhag, that is very serious, because the minhag is a functioning, in the case here, it's very strong. You have a functioning community and or dysfunctioning community, but
Say that.
but you have a very strong idea. This is how we do it in Malmö, in Copenhagen, etc.
I can tell you exactly how long it takes. When I came to Denmark, I made one change from the Mitzvah speech when she had, instead of the end of the prayer, I moved it to the place where the rabbi hold his speech, which should be before Musaf. And there were few very conservative and say that's completely against our tradition. You're not allowed to do it. This is how we do it. Now all these people who were very clear about the tradition here is that Bat Mitzvah speaks at the end. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, about 25 years ago, my cousin was the first Bat Mitzvah in Copenhagen. And they were all against having a Bat Mitzvah in the synagogue. So what 25 years ago they talked against as happening became, this is how we do things. So when they try to start fighting on the thing you do, then you know it's a local tradition.
I just want to say about, just one more thing about what you said. I told my opinion to the people in my community. You said that you talked about it before. Tunes are not minhag hamakom. Never. Tunes, yes, tunes.
Disagree.
Tunes. And
We heard about how many
are something of a way that you connect to God. And there should be a shir chadash every prayer again and again.
The Chosid is talking.
Yes.
He wants to connect to God.
If anybody feels like they want to sing a new song in their prayer to connect closer to God, and someone says this is not Minhag HaMakom, tell them this is the Minhag HaMakom.
If you're listening to Rav Natan and wonder if postmodernism and individualism and spirituality have now also infiltrated and influenced rabbinical circles, then I think that was very interesting, maybe as a summary to all of this discussion. If you saw on page 5, we have the same rabbi who says 2 separate things. We have the same rabbi quoted with 2 different things. Rabbeinu Yerucham, which is one of the prominent halachic books that Joav mentioned before, right? That we follow very closely. So you have 2 of his books, and in one of them he says 3 hours. Right, quoting Rashi, and we don't have that source from Rashi, that he says 3 hours as is following Rashi. And then you have in the same person who says 6 hours. And there's already discussion, because many times it's become academic discussions, but even within the rabbinical circles, it's quite clear. Just imagine how that one letter, Gimel, right? In the old days, before printing press, how easy that Gimel can become Vav, or vice versa. And then someone is copying thousands and thousands of words, and how easy it is for that small type of typo to become such a big thing. So, according to many, since we have it very clearly that the rabbi himself says 6 hours, so it's quite clear that there was a typo, and you can even see where that typo is and how it happened. In that case, you already have communities that have started following what they learned, which is the 3 hour. The 3 hour minhag, which has no source. We saw 1 which has no source, but we know the source. We saw 6, we saw meals, 3 hours, which is a typo. So I saw a letter, and I think this is a good summary.
But who created
So
the reason for the
but at the end you have a community who's following this. So I saw a letter that was written to Rav Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg, one of the greatest halachic giants who passed away a few years ago. He was one of the rabbis who gave me smicha, who ordinated me.
And me too, sorry.
Someone wrote a letter to him saying, I've now come and I've made Aliyah, I moved to Israel. We keep 3 hours. We've always kept 3 hours, but there's no one here keeping 3 hours. Can I continue keeping 3 hours? Because I'm now coming to a new place. But this is a minhag, which is a strong minhag, which I come from. This is how our community did. So he gave the same answer based on what I mentioned before on the Biur Halacha, saying, if you have a community which has the minhag and has its own shul and has its own mikveh and has its own functioning society that follows the minhagim, because you had this after the Holocaust, of course, that affected a lot. So after the Shoah, you had communities that were 10,000 or 20,000 or larger, would then come into a very small shul in Jerusalem. And they end up continuing the minhagim as they were in Frankfurt or as they were in other places. So If you have that, then you can follow it. But if you don't have that, you have to change. So then this person who wrote the letter then writes a note at the bottom and he says, I came to him and I said, I found in Jerusalem that there is such a synagogue. So in such a case, can we follow the 3 hours? And he says that is, so he affirmed that that is the case. I think it's a strong summary in the sense that don't create your own worlds. Don't pick from here and from here and from here. And yes, I have this one. I can, especially in the world of technology, so you can find everything. You can even write that answer. You can even have AI answer you whatever you want, right? But in that sense, you can, right? You can. That's a big question that is coming up, but that's a completely separate thing. But the true understanding of what Am Yisrael is doing is very strong, and that is community based. And I think here you have a very strong sense of community that is almost disappearing in the Jewish world today. That you have communities which are very strong with minhagim that you are becoming a part of, and that is very unique and special, and therefore you should rely on that and become a part. Why did you say something?
Right,
You're done.
better not, because then we will open new things.
Okay, anyone? So I think it's just having the opportunity to share this wisdom in such a way, and physically having the rabbis here is for me very
Physically
special.
having,
Yeah,
And
and even more important.
more important, yeah.
And to have you right with us for the Shabbat and those who joined today has been fantastic. And hopefully, as we said yesterday at the end of Shabbat, this will create a stronger sense also for you to be with one another, to feel togetherness, to support one another. And people are at different stages, and that's perfect. And it just be there for one another. Feel free to call one another. So and the seriousness of the Torah learning is not to be taken for granted. The halacha, the Torah, the minhag, everything that we're discussing. So we're going to break now for lunch and say farewell to everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Jair, very much for hosting us here, and Sophie and Mia.
Yes, Sophie, Mia.
For helping.
Really, it was amazing with your help. Thank you, Justin, for all the sugar.
Okay, to that, and continue to see each other. Truly meet again physically, unless you guys start visiting each other, would be fantastic. But we will have another.
But we have some bagels. We don't want to make sandwiches for lunch, but I need to know how many want that because they're frozen. I just need to take them to the oven. So who wants to sandwich?